Hey everyone, welcome to M2F Story. Today I am going to share with you Being Girl for the Summer Part 4, written by Amanda Walker. Then the photographer and report from the local paper arrived, and after a group photo, then one of Susan holding the little boy the Fosters were leaving. "I hope you have your own children one day, you're a natural," said Mrs. Foster. "If only you knew," thought Susan. The reporter was gentle, just adding Susan's comments of what she remembered and soon left them alone. The main thing the paper wanted was the photograph for the feel-good section. They then noticed the envelope the Fosters had left behind. Thinking it was another thank you card, Susan's aunt opened it. There was a card, but there was also a check for $5,000. Karen and Susan's aunt were shocked and pleased, but felt it would be too much for Susan to cope with right now. Susan now wanted to sleep. They cleansed the makeup and then left her to sleep and dream. Her girl had returned to her and, more importantly, bore no ill will. Over the next few days, as Susan got better, Karen visited regularly and they talked over their new relationship. Karen relieved that the confused feelings of love for another could be returned within a conventional relationship even if your boyfriend did look better than you did in your own dresses. Susan relieved that the relationship he thought was doomed looked to have a future. Susan was initially embarrassed by the large sum of money gifted as a reward, but accepted it as the will of the Fosters. She decided to spend a little and save a lot. Once she was discharged, they were together always. Karen initially wheeled Susan around in a wheelchair, although she was soon up on crutches, eager to get mobile and independent again. At least a skirt is convenient when you're wearing a plaster cast, thought Susan. So passed the next few weeks. Their summer holiday curtailed in mobility, but not less enjoyable. Then there came the day both were dreading, when Susan would return to being John, and they would both leave the valley and return to their parents. Their aunts decided to take them out to dinner in their best frocks and generally make a big fuss. They never did tell Karen's aunt the truth. Susan and Karen spent the night together afterwards as girls for the last time this summer. They talked and kissed and pleasured each other. They promised undying love for each other and looked forward to their next meeting in October at the christening. The next day, Susan left with her aunt, and after staying a night in Kendall where a more boyish cut was made to her hair, John reappeared, and some appropriate new clothes purchased before he returned home. October soon arrived, and although they had exchanged email, letters, and innumerable phone calls, they were desperate to be reunited. John repeated the deception by meeting his aunt on a Thursday night in Kendall to change clothes and hairstyle. On the Friday, Susan officially arrived in Skilthwaite. Karen arrived late the same day. The christening was to be on the Sunday at Near Sorry, leaving them Saturday to choose something suitable to wear and get their hair done. They met after breakfast at Susan's aunt's. She knew they needed a few private minutes. Later, the proud aunts took their nieces back into Kendall to find suitable suits and allow the girls to get their hair and nails done. Susan's, of course, needed most work. While the girls were in the hairdressers, the aunts shopped for themselves, then met them in J.R. Taylor's for coffee. They were looking for something smart, formal, and they had the reward money to spend. They decided to go for a complete inside-to-out shop. So after selecting knitted dresses with matching jackets from the Basler range, they found suitable stockings and new lingerie ensembles. There were some funny looks from passers-by and assistants at the giggling and squeals, as the girls took great delight in modeling their new clothes for each other. They were going to have fun in private tonight. Finally, everything was acquired, and they returned to the valley. Karen's aunt invited them to have tea, and they went home to hang up their purchases. "You and Karen, feelings just as strong?" asked Susan's aunt. "Stronger, if anything. We've both had time to think. There were elements of deception in the relationship. She thought she'd fallen for a girl and was in conflict with her emotions. I wanted her, but felt I couldn't make a move as a girl. I don't think I would have got close to her as the sloppy teenage boy that I was. We achieved a closeness that boys and girls our age rarely encounter. I love her from the inside out, and I think, in fact, I'm sure, she feels the same." "That's lovely. You are right, she is a lovely girl, and I'm so pleased you are together, but do be careful. You are a boy, and she's a girl. Make sure she wants the boy as well as Susan." "I'm aware of that. After the christening, I'm going back to being John for the rest of the week. We'll see where we go from there." "Wise move. I really hope it all works out." That night after dinner, Karen and Susan went upstairs while their aunts sipped sherry. They both slipped into night dresses and lay on the bed in each other's arms. The feeling of the thin, silky fabrics produced electric feelings in both of their bodies. They kissed and cuddled quietly, just enjoying the intimacy. "Will you love me as a boy?" asked Susan. "I love the person. The fact that I can enjoy that person as boy or girl isn't important. Maybe I should try being the boy for a change," replied Karen. "I still have worries that our relationship is based on the girls we are today." No, wait, I couldn't have a relationship with a real girl. I just couldn't. I know who and what you are. If we are to continue, it will be as John and Karen with Susan popping in for a bit of fun sometimes. Is that all right with you? That is perfect, just perfect. If you never saw Susan again, would it matter? No. But it is a special secret we share, and I do enjoy the fact that we can relax like this. It's like having a special girlfriend. I'd like you to keep the clothes and let Susan visit every now and then. Anyway, I'll have to be a godmother on occasion, too. Oh, yes, I'd forgotten that. It's a long-term commitment. It seemed so right when I agreed on your behalf. Don't worry. After tomorrow, there won't be much to do, just birthday and Xmas cards. And when you get invited to his wedding, do you know your godparents? Enough said. Their aunts found them asleep on the bed, cradled in each other's arms. There seemed no point in disturbing them, so they covered them up and left them for the night. The next day, they awoke early and were quite surprised and yet pleased to find themselves together. Susan left after breakfast to go and get ready. The christening was to be part of the Sunday service at Sorry Church, followed by a reception at the nearby Salutation Hotel. They were all ready by 10 o'clock and set off for the short journey to Sorry. As they were on the car ferry across Windermere, the girls had got out of the car and stood looking at the mountains in the distance flecked with the first winter snow. Karen's aunt took a picture, which in later years they realized showed them in a state of contentment, happiness, and most importantly, love. They arrived in the church car park and, being unfamiliar with the layout, were pleased that Mr. Foster and the vicar were there to greet them. They ran through the actions and timetable of the service. It was beautiful, clear autumn morning when the Lake District looks its best, and although there was a chill in the air, their suits and the sunshine kept them warm. People were milling about, and they were introduced to friends and relatives of the Fosters, all of whom, of course, had heard of Susan's bravery. Later, the little boy and his mother arrived. Of course, he was too old for a christening robe, so he was in a little sailor suit. His wanderlust had not been checked, and as soon as he was out of the car, he rushed to his father and the girls asking to be picked up. Susan gathered up the little boy, then seeing that everyone was moving inside, handed him back to his father. The vicar led them to the reserved pews, and the service began. The vicar included the christening within the main service, which meant Karen and Susan had to go forward to the font. At this point, the attention and consequences of being found out in this company made Susan start to get nervous, and she held onto Karen's hand. Holding a candle, the vicar mesmerized the young boy, and the ritual began, each godparent giving his or her vows. After the service, the godparents and family gathered for photos, a beautiful church with a superb backdrop. The party then walked the short distance to the hotel. Two older cousins of the little boy escorted Karen and Susan. They were about the same age as Karen and Susan and were very keen to walk with them to the reception. Mark and Kevin had also managed to ensure they were sat with the girls on the table plan for the meal. "I think we're in here," said Karen. "That's what I'm worried about," replied Susan. "Just go with the flow. I won't be envious if you won't." "I'll be polite, that's all. It's you I want." "Well, I'm going to be polite, but I'll have some fun as well. Enjoy being treated with some courtesy by the young gentlemen." A waiter offered them sherry, and their escorts were given a beer. One of the downsides of femininity, thought Susan. I could murder a pint. As they circulated, Susan had to repeat the story of the rescue several times. Karen added the parts that Susan still couldn't remember. Mark had by now attached himself to Karen, while Kevin favored Susan. Susan had now relaxed, and seeing how Karen allowed Mark to hold her arm, or direct her with his arm around her waist, felt why not. And when Kevin did the same, she did not resist. The boys took this as a good sign and felt very pleased with themselves as they stayed with the girls all the time. Finally, the meal was ready, and the boys were perfect gentlemen, assisting Karen and Susan with their chairs and getting them another drink. Karen smiled as she noticed Susan accepting the female role. She knew she didn't really like this, but felt she should get the full experience of what it is to be a girl. Mar and Kevin were getting bolder now, and both girls noticed accidental touches under the table. Their dresses were both above the knee in length, and sat down there was plenty of exposed thigh for wandering hands. Eventually, the boys' hands were resting on the girls' legs, and now fingers were straying further. Karen smiled as they imagined Susan's discomfort, and to relieve matters, she took her beau's hand in hers and raised it to the table as if to say enough. Susan noticed and did the same. They kept the boys busy during the main course, allowing them to serve their meals, which they gladly did. "Shall we just powder our noses?" asked Karen before the sweet course was served. "Was Mark doing to you what Kevin was doing to me?" inquired Susan once they reached the safety of the ladies' room. "I think he was doing exactly the same. A bit of retaliation is called for." She then whispered what she wanted Susan to do. Susan had a look of horror, but Karen laughed. "Just don't go too far." When they returned to their places, another drink had been provided. Both smiled. "They think they're plying us with drink," thought Susan. They sat down, but when the sweet trolley came around, they declined, but insisted that the boys have their choice. Karen and Susan now finished their drinks, and while the boys' hands were occupied, allowed their hands to stroke their inner thighs, they then worked towards their target, causing both boys to blush slightly and become very aroused. They didn't go too far, and as soon as they had achieved a reaction, they stopped and asked for another drink. This left the boys in some discomfort as they tried to conceal their excitement, while appearing macho and in control. Karen and Susan laughed, and the boys smiled as they realized how the girls had retaliated. The boys didn't return immediately. Susan smiled, realizing they had gone to obtain some relief. They were a little deflated when they returned with the drinks, but still good company. Now Mr. Foster stood up to thank everyone for attending and proposed a toast to his little boy for a safe, healthy, and prosperous life. Mrs. Foster then joined him with their son in her arms and proposed another toast to Susan and Karen, without whom we wouldn't be celebrating today. Susan and Karen were quite embarrassed, but sat and accepted the congratulations. Mark and Kevin loosened up, and after patting them on the back, felt brave enough to kiss them both on the cheek. As the party began to break up and Susan and Karen went to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Foster, the little boy was fast asleep. He'd had another exciting day. As they were leaving, Mark and Kevin moved to cut them off. "I'm sorry if we were a bit forward. I'd really like to see you again," said Mark. "Me too," said Kevin. "I'm sorry, but we're both spoken for, almost engaged, in fact," said Susan with a smile towards Karen. "Oh, that's a shame. Sorry, I mean, congratulations. Could I just have one kiss before we leave?" "Me too," said Kevin. "I don't see why not, okay, Karen?" "It's only fair," she smiled. The boys took their girl and, starting gently, kissed, then encountering no resistance, opened their lips for a passionate embrace. Susan felt the power of Kevin's arms around her, and as she went weak at the knees, he felt the need to steady her. "They're pretty good at this," said Karen, coming up for air. "May I?" said Kevin to Karen. Mark looked at Susan. The girls nodded and repeated the experience. "Well, thank you, gentlemen, but now we must go. Our aunts will be waiting to take us home," said Karen. The boys looked disappointed, but helped them with their jackets and wished them farewell. They noticed the obvious affection between Susan and Karen as they walked away hand in hand. "You don't think they're—" "No, couldn't be. Well, maybe. You never can tell." That night, once they were back in Winster, Susan and Karen walked hand in hand down the lane, where they first were alone together. They found a bench, and when Karen was sat down, Susan went down on one knee. "I was going to wait until I was back as John, but I can't hold myself back any longer. Will you marry me? As John, as Susan, as anybody you wish." "Oh, yes, my love. I love the person in front of me, in a dress, a suit, or preferably nothing at all." "Thank you. I'm sorry I haven't got a ring yet." "Don't worry. We've got each other. That's the important thing." They kissed, and then they returned to Karen's aunts and once again fell asleep in each other's arms. Karen and John, introduced as a cousin of Susan, were married in the little slate church in Winster. There was surprise in the village that her great friend Susan couldn't make the wedding, but she had sent a card and present. Susan did make occasional visits to her aunt. Karen's husband would be away, and she would join her friend in the beautiful valley. Susan was godmother in absentia to John and Karen's little girl, whom they had christened at Sorry a few years later. And they all lived happily ever after. Fin. That's it for today. Hope you have enjoyed it. If you do, then be sure to subscribe for the next story.